All right, so in this one, I want to kind of work with the concepts of spirit, soul, heart, body, and environment. And I want to kind of lay out how, in my conception of things, they kind of interconnect. I'll briefly talk about where they fit in the larger picture, but my focus is going to be on how they, in combination, essentially create the experience of a lifetime that we're all familiar with, of course, but that we tend to think of, I'll call it in the materialist sense, not in terms of like consumption or online shopping, but more in the sense of, conceiving of ourselves really only as physical beings, not necessarily having a divine nature. And of course, there's a model of life that kind of fits neatly within that, right? You can use evolution maybe as the primary paradigm for it. And I want to kind of flex that concept and kind of see if we can find origins of life that go into the divine realm, kind of past the sensory and cognitive limit. And I want to show the soul as kind of the portal that can allow insight and discovery of that realm beyond what our physical senses are able to notice. Okay, so just a brief kind of meta-cosmology layout, as I often do at the beginning. Right, oneness, God, spirit, individual physical being, right? Kind of nested within this Venn diagram, right? And I won't draw a line around oneness this time because oneness is everything. Oneness is all. Oneness is in its original state is the state of pure potential from which all springs. God is everything physical, everything experienceable. God is all sides of the equation, all conjugations of the verb, all parts of speech. God is all facets of the jewel. You are God, I am God, this pen is God, this board is God, this video is God, my eyelash is God, everything is God. It's kind of unremarkable in its godness. What's shocking to us and to our primate brains is that this could all be a unified field or a single thing. We chunk our environment into so many different things. The concept of kind of a whole field of God in which all of this arises just doesn't really make sense to the primate brain. Where I'm going to focus in this video is down in this segment here, talking about the spirit and the individual being, and essentially the way I'm going to map it out, I'm going to make it horizontal eventually, but I'll just kind of show on here how it fits. The soul will kind of be the portal between the spirit and the individual being, and then the environment will be the physical experience that the being has, right? It's kind of the world in which it inhabits. So for me here, right, this is my environment, things I can experience through my senses. And so let me now kind of take this piece and then I'm going to turn it horizontally and have it arrayed this way. Oh, and then just one other thing I'll throw on there to kind of anchor it for myself is the human heart, which maybe I'll kind of draw right now like this. Because I think it really has kind of a supernatural or kind of like demi-supernatural quality that plays a role here in the way the soul interacts with the environment. So I don't want to forget that bad boy. So we got our spirit, we got our individual perspective. And the difference here is this is the perspective that's fully associated with the physical form, right? So every time I'm on earth, right, every time I wake up in the morning, every time I'm in the bathroom and I look in the mirror, I'm always experiencing life from the perspective of this physical being, right? I'm always looking out through these eyes, right? Whenever I touch my face, I'm touching this face. I feel within this body. If I see another person nearby, I may connect with that person, right? I may feel a sense of oneness and sameness with that person, but the difference is in this perspective, right? They're here and I'm here, but my withinness is here. I never, or at least in this life or this experience of this life, I don't feel what it's like to be inside of this person's body, looking out and seeing me there. And that's why mirrors are so interesting, because an individual stands in front of a mirror, right, and seems to almost see another thing looking back at them. Of course, that's just an illusion created by the brain. It's their own reflection going back. But that's maybe the closest we get from this perspective to encountering what it's like to have another person that's kind of like us and kind of isn't. So, physical being, right, this lowercase I, the spirit perspective is much more of an overview. I think of it as kind of like the sun in the sky that shines on everything that's there. If there's two individuals, those two individual spirits are really in an act of co-creation with each other. And so when these two people are talking back and forth, shaking hands, fighting, stabbing each other, sharing a laugh, their spirits are actually in a fully intermixed way producing that experience for the both of them. So it's not like this person's spirit's over here kind of in their corner like a boxer giving them information or suggestions, and this person's on the other side. The spirits are fully intermixed and fully blended in their co-creativity, and the separateness that manifests down here, again, me only being in this perspective, you only being in this perspective, is part of the creation of the spirits, right? It's part of what the spirits are collaborating on. But the spirits are fully collaborating, fully intermixing their creative powers, and the separateness is only manifesting below. I keep jumping into tangents here. What I really want to do is trace an individual being's, right, mine or your kind of line from the spirit world into the physical world or environment, which I designate with E, right? Again, E is environment, everything you can sense through your physical senses. The human body, right, is environment, but what's unique about it is this being experiences the human body as feelable from within, right? So that's the difference, suppose, between my body and this eraser. I can feel this eraser from the outside, right? I can, through my skin, get there, right? I can taste it, smell it, see it, hear it, but I cannot feel the insideness of it the way I do with my own body, right? Through my senses, I can feel kind of my organs. I can feel kind of the underside maybe of my skin. I can feel kind of, when I knock on my skull, it feels like someone's kind of knocking on a door and I'm on the inside. Right? That's how you kind of know what's your body and what's the other thing. And so the difference is, right, if the eraser's here, the individual being, this whole thing is its environment, but the reason it has a special relationship with its body and identifies with its body so closely is that it has a unique relationship with its body that it doesn't have with anything else in its environment, and that's what I call the feelable withinness. Okay, so what's interesting here, I'm going to put the soul here, and I'm going to put the heart here. I really think, though, that it's kind of more like this. That this perspective here is really the perspective of kind of the human heart, right? The physical beating heart in the environment. And then the soul, which is kind of this bridge, right, this portal, aperture between spirit and being. And, you know, everything is one, so all this segmenting out and dividing out is really just to try to get conceptual clarity that hopefully it ultimately leads to better understanding and better living. But all the distinctions are purely conceptual. They're not really, at their essence, full distinctions. But I think the heart and the soul are really interconnected and really interplay with each other. But just for the sake of clarity, and again, to try to kind of hash out or play with these ideas, I'll put them in this arrangement for now, but this is maybe a bit provisional. And so these are the 5 ingredients that I'm going to try to work with in this video. What am I? 9 minutes in, I'm getting to the meat of it now. Okay, so spirit, and just for context, right, is an individual being of God, right? And so one individual, right, would occupy this string, but another individual would occupy this one, another individual this one, all emanating off of God. You could think of this like an octopus, right? This is the head, here's one tentacle, here's another tentacle, here's another one, all one being. But down here on this level, if you're kind of cut off from information, say here, and all you're looking at is in this direction, then all they see is separateness, because it's one tentacle looking at the other, right, and looking at the other, not appreciating that they're actually emanating out of a single source. So now, though, in this tight zoom, we have spirit. Now, spirit, again, is the individuated perspective and individuated perspective of God. I think the reason, or a reason, that God individuates into spirit is to essentially give God a perspective through which to express and experience God's self. If we think of, say, the physical universe, right, as something like this, I know that a physicist may be puking right now, but let's just imagine that the physical universe is something like that. If God is just a whole individual thing, God can experience God's wholeness, but God doesn't have a perspective from which to look out at the remainder of God's self and essentially get a different view. And so you could think of the spirits as being all these little holes or apertures, or like little light bulbs that are in here, little viewpoints, little telescopes, right? And it's through these, right, that God can then look out and see the remainder of God's self. And just imagine a web moving in all directions. I think that's essentially what Indra's web is, right? A fully interconnected, fully integrated network of individuated perspectives, all of which provide essentially kind of a holistic panorama view through the combination of them. And God is essentially kind of the one at the center of the jewel that is able to look out through all of these different aspects and then essentially reconstructs an image, kind of like a spider that has 8 different eyes, right? Then tries to construct it into an image that it can see and act from. I think God is kind of acting that way, and the spirits are kind of its eyes. But the trippy thing is, God's not looking out on some physical foreign environment that is other than God's self. God is beholding God's self through these apertures, which are also God's self, right? That's kind of the mishmashiness of oneness that the primate brain, which really likes to chunk things into friends and enemies, food and not food, right? To kind of understand its environment. It's always kind of negative, positive. The whole idea of this all being one and yet being distinguishable is really difficult for our brains, I think, to comprehend. All right, have I contextualized enough? I keep promising to get into this. Okay, so what I think is happening here is you've got a spirit. The spirit's then manifesting into the body. And when the spirit goes, right, individuates into a physical form, the spirit's doing this. First of all, I think the spirit's doing this in multiple individual bodies at once. I use this image of the spirit like the hubcap in the middle of the wheel, right? And these are the borders of the wheel. Each of these an individual life. They may be occurring at different times on a timeline, right? You've got one in ancient Egypt, one in the 1900s, one in the year 3000. But from the perspective of the spirit isn't in the flow of time. The spirit does maybe experience something akin to a sequence or a process, but I don't think that it's experiencing things on a timeline. And so that's why from the spirit's perspective, I try to arrange it more in a circle to indicate the way it's more simultaneous for the spirit's experience. So right now, again, we're insetted on a single incarnation of this spirit, and that's what we have here. And again, I think a major reason the spirit's doing this is because the spirit has within it, right, this core of basically the origins of suffering, right, which is this concept of elseness, the notion of separateness, this logical fallacy or inconsistency within the general whole of oneness. The truth of oneness is that all is one, one is all. There is no separation, there is no difference. And yet, I think in order for oneness, which is a state of pure potential, which exists in no time and no space, to have a physical experience, I think it introduces or concentrates upon this logical contradiction, and then that essentially gives it kind of a headache or a boiling in it, which then springs out the entirety of the universe. I've got some other videos that talk about that. I won't deep dive that here. But oneness is essentially then individuating a being, and over the course of the being's life, will reconstruct that line bit by bit, trauma by trauma, and that the reason the spirit is having the individual life is instead of experiencing this folded oneness, right? So you could think of this as kind of a circle that's been twisted and contorted in a series of ways. And the way it produces elseness is if you're here and you're here, right? X is here, Y is here. they look at each other and they seem to experience difference, right? Oh, I'm here, you're there, I'm this, you're that, when really they're just points on the same line. It's the folding and the twisting, right, that allows the oneness to seem to have this difference. So anyway, the spirit, though, on the spirit level, kind of deals in sacred geometry. It sees things spatially, but doesn't have the intimacy of feeling. And what we on the human level are able to do, right, I talked about that feelable withinness. Inside of our body, we feel pain, right, and we feel pleasure. We feel emotions viscerally. We feel them physically, right? We can almost create a 3D map if we pay very close attention to our feelings and to how they move within us. And I think it's this desire for intimacy, to really engage with the intricacies of this pattern and this design, is the reason we individuate from spirit to physical being, the reason we incarnate from, say, an ethereal realm outside of time into a dense realm in which time seems to flow and pass. And the soul, which I've represented here, what I'm picturing here is kind of like a glass orb, something that optically has the ability to look in all directions. That's what I'm picturing the soul as. And the soul is kind of this portal, right? This passage point through which information is shared on the spirit level to the incarnated level, right? Again, these really are one thing, right? And this is one with all. But the soul is how these are able to have different experiences and yet share information with each other. And so, for example, narrowing down on these little coils of elseness, the individual being is feeling this, right? Feeling in its guts, experiencing the emotions in its brain, and is sharing that data in this direction to the spirit. The spirit then is kind of the map maker, the cartographer, the one that has that higher perspective, is able to kind of see the bigger picture. And so this one's feeding all the raw data, and this is kind of the mapping program that takes all that raw data and essentially puts it together. You may think of it another way with like a puzzle. This one's feeding one piece, one piece, one piece, and this is the one that's taking all the pieces, kind of laying it on the table, and then beginning to snap them together to get the fuller picture of what is. And again, on the bigger level, the spirits are then feeding that all back to God, and God is the master cartographer, the master map maker, the master puzzle solver, piecing together all the information that the spirits have, which the spirits all get from their incarnated beings. So the soul is kind of this, again, this portal, this fiber optic cable, this connector that allows the spirit and the incarnated being to share information. And then the human heart is what I'm seeing as the same thing between the individuated perspective, again, the being that seems to experience itself as being within this body and not within this other body, and the environment, right? And so I would say that here what you're dealing with is sensory information, right? Seeing, touching, hearing, tasting, smelling. That's how the individual being in its body, and again, the body really is a feature of the environment, is getting that information back into itself and then feeding that as part of the data stream that's going back into the spirit. And what I think is kind of wild about this is it may seem like, okay, you've got this individual world here where you've got trees and birds, clouds, volcanoes, right? That's all the environment, and that's like one realm or place. And then the spirit world is where you have something maybe kind of like the astral plane, or these more dreamlike realms, which aren't really physical in a sense. They may be experienceable as like something you can move through, but they don't have the density and the persistence of what we have down here. What I think is kind of wild, though, if I could kind of redraw this just to get a clean start, is that this is a projection moving in this direction, right? And so oneness projects God, right? God projects the individual spirits, and then this individual spirit projects through the soul, its individualized perspective, which then projects through the heart, the physical environment. And the statement, like, imagine the most radical version of this statement that you can picture, and that is what I'm saying, that essentially the spirit is creating the entirety of the physical environment that the individual being experiences, including other people. And the spirit is doing that, is feeding that information to the individual perspective through the soul, and then that the individual being through its heart is then projecting that entire information out. And of course, from our perspective, that's not how it seems. We seem to be a human body, right? And I'm here, okay? And this tree is over there, and my heart is this beating thing in here. But this tree has distance from me, and this tree exists separate and apart from me. It is not part of me, it is not an expression of me, it is not an extension of me. But what I believe to be true is that essentially they are all features of the same projection emanating out of this source. And so let me play with this a little more. So basically, the idea is everything in the world Florida, California, right? Africa, Europe, and all this over there. Flip the globe, we got Asia. All the way out to the entirety of the universe, right? Out to the edges of the observable universe is all being created in this stream. What's being created for this individual being is everything in this individual being's sensible environment, right? So everything this individual being can take in through its physical senses is not coming outward, out in. It's actually in out. Now, the experience, though, of course, is out in, right? So I see this pen as being outside of myself. The model of how I perceive it is light is bouncing off the pen, going into my eye, going into my brain. My brain then generates an image of the pen. And of course, that is what we have as the objective scientific experience here in this realm. What I'm saying, though, is behind that, the way that this realm is even created for us to have this experience or this conceptual consensus is it's actually being co-created by all the spirits who inhabit that realm, right, through God, through the individual beings, and then projected outward. And what I think is kind of wild about this is it then puts the body in a different perspective, because the body would then be the first aspect of the environment that this individuated perspective is able to experience. So in other words, the body, and I'm putting it outside, but really it would be more like this. Legs, arms, eye, and eye is emanating outward from inside the body, right? I'm again putting it in the heart space. And so the body is essentially the first feature of the environment that this perspective encounters, right? That's why it has that feelable withinness. It's literally, if it's a seed in the core, the body is kind of the sprout born around it. And then of course you have these other physical experiences around, the birds, the clouds, the trees, the ground, right? All these things. These are also all emanations, right, from that individual perspective. But the reason we identify with the body so much is there's such a density of information in here. And you got this noodle up here that's like its own little funhouse, house of mirrors, a little labyrinth. This energy can get getting sucked up in here, and our sense of self can essentially get wrapped around here, where we start to think this is I, right? This is all I am, and everything past this little bubble is else, right? Is other. And this model says that a better view is that everything experienceable is a projection or emanation from this core source. that the reason we identify with the body is that we have so access to such dense and rich information of the body because it's the most intimate and proximate feature of our physical environment. But that every feature of our physical environment is equally a projection of the source, separate and apart from our identification with it. I think if we map this onto, say, Buddhism, and Buddha talks about essentially disidentifying with our wants and our desires, not giving them the specialness or the urgency we normally attribute to them, is kind of this same idea. It's getting out of this closed system loop and thinking that this is all the information that I am or that really matters to me, and this is maybe a foreign or hostile or unpredictable world all around me, seeing all of this as an expression of your spirit. As essentially, I say projection, but I think it's really kind of the spirit painting a portrait of itself all the time. And we're always going to have a special relationship with our body because, again, it's the only thing we feel and experience from within. But I think that feelable withinness is actually kind of a hint to us to recognize that the world is being created from inside out as opposed to just outside in. I think the other thing I want to mention here, because you may have been thinking, okay, well, if I've got an individual being, right, who's got this, and then the world's going out here, this can start to look like solipsism, right? The notion that, well, there's only one conscious being in the world, and the individual who's talking about it thinks that they're it. And from God's perspective, there's a truth to that. From the individual perspective, of course, this is one of just millions on this planet, potentially one of trillions of sentient beings in our physical universe, and this universe is one of who knows how many. So what's crazy about this is that each individual being is projecting its own universe, right, from its perspective. And the reason we're able to have, right, to save time, just picture that that's a body I drew around there. The reason these three people are able to have a fully integrated experience where it really does feel like we're on an earth together having a life is because all their spirits are collaborating in the creation of the experience, and it's all emanating from the single data stream of God, which is emanating from the oneness from which all this potential springs. Because obviously, if we're thinking about trying to coordinate this on an improvisational level, the computations and the complexity are just almost unimaginable, right? The human brain certainly wouldn't have the capacity to do that. But if we think instead that everything physical is a projection, and that they all essentially stream from the same headwaters, right? You can use kind of a river model. You got the headwaters, the main flow of the river, then some tributaries go off. And then say this tributary gets to the ocean and goes into a delta. Right? This is kind of like God, spirit, and then individual beings. Right? And so because they all have the same information coming to them, the same source code, the same data stream, they're not having to generate anything, right? And they're not actually having to do any coordination. It's all done by God. What they do is they then just project through the soul to the individual being, which projects out of the heart into the physical world, and they're all sharing a common experience in a physical environment that is fully collaborative, fully integrated. And we're all doing our individual work, right, with our little coil of elseness. And that's not by any means the only purpose of life, but I think that is a significant part of it. And we're able to love each other and have conversations with each other and dance with each other. And I think the materialistic model, the bottom up, if you limit yourself to sensory and cognitive experience, the sensory and cognitive level, you would essentially cut it off here. You'd say, all I can rely on is what I can perceive through my senses and test through experimentation. That's how we've arrived where we're at with the theory of evolution. And we would say, okay, there's physical matter on the earth. It arrayed itself into higher and higher levels of complexity through the process of natural selection, genes being the bits that carried information along. And we are now these individual beings, but we have no connectivity, right? The tree of life only extends upward from the roots of the earth, right? And we are all branches on the tree of life together. And but there's nothing in the other direction, right? We're essentially kind of the top of the canopy, looking up under the stars, but there is no coordination on the creative level, right? Everything is then operating by chance under physical law. And what this does is this takes the tree of life and brings it to the other perspective as well, from God, branching out into spirits, right? And then branching out into individual beings. So that's how you essentially get, I saw this image, a woman had a tattoo on her arm the other day of the tree of life sprouting in each direction off of a common coil. And I think that's kind of this notion here. And so coming back to the notion of the soul, I know it's been kind of buried here in my drawing, but the soul is really the pivot point where we as individual beings and we as spirit beings, which we always are, I think are able to kind of take a look through something like a two-way mirror and begin to recognize the nature of existence, right? That we're not simply spirits in an ethereal realm or physical beings in a physical realm. We're really both simultaneously. And the soul, again, picturing here like a glass orb paperweight or something like that, is this perspective where we as consciousness, right, we as conscious awareness can go into this space and simultaneously look out on a physical world and environment, right, see the trees and the clouds, feel the body, and then can then look back through insight into the ethereal realm. And in my experience, when you're looking back, it's not like you turn around and you're just looking in another direction and you're seeing a landscape with mountains and things like that. What we see here and experience here isn't really seen through the physical eyes, right? It's maybe seen through the third eye. It's seen through insight. And concepts come, insights come, but they come really in a more intuitive way. They come more in the form of epiphany, or they'll gather gradually over time and form an image that coalesces. And this is what I think meditation, right, or insight training or things like that help us develop, is to not just constantly have a one-way view of the soul where we're only looking in this direction, right? If you have a purely materialistic view and you think that scientific data, the scientific process is the only way to gather reliable information, then you essentially cut your soul in half and you neglect this, right? You cast this into darkness, deny any information that's coming that way, and only gather information here. I think a wiser perspective, one that embraces the wholeness of what we are, is to embrace the panoptic nature of the soul and embrace the fact that we as spiritual beings can see through the soul from the spirit's perspective into the physical environment, and that we have this wild ability as physical beings to look back through the soul and actually see back inwards up toward our origin. And that enlightenment is the experience of an individual being, right, in a physical body, right? This is what I think happened with the Buddha, is he essentially looked all the way back, right, past his spirit self, past even God's self in the individual physical universe in which he's incarnated, and got back to what he called emptiness, right, or nothingness, non-self, anatta, which is what you have in oneness, which is that state of pure potential, which has no space, has no time, and yet within it somehow contains the seeds of the potential for all the wild and diverse expressiveness we see. And just imagine all the diversity we see manifested on this one planet, which is one rock in one star in one galaxy, one of billions of galaxies in the universe. And this is just the universe we know of. This could perhaps be one of billions, trillions, maybe even a number we haven't conceived of yet of universes. That's what's sitting in potential here. And I think from his perspective as the Buddha, when he enlightened, he essentially, as an observer, was able to go back through the portal of his soul, all the way back to this state of oneness, and essentially realize the source from which we came. And I think when you return from that experience, that's essentially what allows him to drop the agendas of this body, not be so hung up in desires, wants, cravings, the itchings and the urgings of what is, because once you've really experienced this as being just as real as this, it's really hard to take this one little eye's concern so seriously when it's one of perhaps trillions or gazillions of eyes all emanating out of this here. And yet it also doesn't cause you to neglect your body, right? Or just cast your body away. The Buddha lived for 45 years after his enlightenment. bathed himself, fed himself, clothed himself, treated his body with dignity. Why? Well, I don't think there's any one reason, but certainly he would have recognized, hey, this is the body in this lifetime through which I get to look out at this world, right? This is my feelable withinness in this life. And for the rest of the time that I'm here, well, I'm going to be doing my teaching, sharing my insights with all the other people that are here to help them try to reduce their suffering and increase their thriving in their life. This is my vessel. This is my portal. This is my vehicle. And this is the way I feel and engage with the world. And so instead of causing us to kind of cast ourselves away, right, the whole thing about non-self may seem like a neglect or denial of self. Instead, what it is, I think it's a resituating of self within the much larger perspective from which the individual being comes, and then you're able to come back and not be addicted to this, right, or just be caught in a closed system of what the individual being wants. You're able to see the body as an opportunity to connect with others, to share with others, and to help others reduce their suffering. And so I guess the last thing I'll say is I think the human heart, and when I'm talking about the heart, I am talking about the physical organ. I'm also intending to talk about the heart chakra, which we can see of as kind of a spiraling energy inside the body, its primary color being green. That this is essentially kind of just as the soul is the portal through which the individual perspective engages with insight and outsight. I think this is the way that the individual being engages with its environment and shares information between. And so the body being feelable within this, the heart is situated dead center in the body and is the way that this I essentially finds itself and is at home in the world, is that it's at home in the heart. And one of the ways we suffer is we go up into the noodle, into the processor, which in a perfect arrangement, I think, is serving the heart's goals, right? The heart's goal is to share love, to spread love, to help beings reduce suffering. And the brain can be thinking of ideas for that, right? Ways to help with teachings, ways to help connect with people. But instead, we have things flipped around. The brain thinks what it's doing is serving this body. This body has cravings for sex, for food, for pride, for adulation, for adoration, for status, for a sense of itself as something important, right? And this is a product of our evolution, right, as social beings, as beings in tribes. The ones who were able to outcompete the others could pass their genes to the next generation, et cetera, et cetera. So it's no accident that our bodies crave these things. But when the brain thinks its job is to serve the body as opposed to serving the human heart, right, which is really the human soul, that's when you can flip the paradigm and you can see people who are able to operate out of a much more selfless way of being. And again, the selfless way of being isn't a denial that they are an individual being. They don't just starve themselves, right, and waste away. They still care for their bodies, but they're not caring for their bodies like they're trying to feed an addiction. Instead, they're recognizing that the bodies are the way that they can operate in time and carry out the larger purposes of the human heart, which emerge in time, right? They don't have to have it all planned out in the head in advance. They don't have to rack their brains to try to figure out what's going on. They trust this data stream stemming from God through the spirit, through the individual perspective into the human heart. And with every beat of the heart, they get the information they need. They get the wisdom they need. Because again, they're no longer conceiving themselves as this closed system that needs to take care of all these cravings and then fend off threats from the environment. They're seeing a life as an opportunity to express their heart, express the truths of their heart, and try to activate and enliven the hearts of others. And so they then essentially then turn the brain from master into servant, and it's serving the heart instead of trying to be this master that's getting the heart to serve the cravings of the body. Okay.